Hi everyone. I just want to begin week 6 with a few preparatory thoughts to help us engage in the readings and discuss the ways in which damage-centered narratives live, what they do, and the single stories that they create in early childhood education. I'd like to begin by imagining the stories that you hold on to of the things that you did as a child. The stories people tell of the memorable moments of your life, the stories that in many ways make you you. These handfuls of stories in many ways, I think, shape who we are and who we become. And as educators, the stories that we tell of children do something. The language we use in telling them also does something. So in many ways, people often become the stories that are told of them. So it's important to really think about what stories we choose to tell and how we're telling them. So this week, Eve Tuck brings attention to the implications of damage-centered narratives or damage-centered research that stories the traumas, plight, and disadvantages of certain peoples. That's often used to leverage reparations or resources for marginalized communities, yet simultaneously reinforces and reinscribes a one-dimensional notion of these people as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. So Tuck is mainly speaking from a research perspective, yet I think her arguments are particularly salient in educational contexts and in the stories that are often told of children. So in chapter 9 of our text, we see how these damage-centered narratives live within early childhood education, particularly where children with impairments are concerned. In this sense, discourses of disability circulate through pathologizing notions of assessment and diagnosis and locate problems within individual bodies. On page 160, the authors discuss a sociocultural view and discourse of disability that supports the view that it is disabling attitudes and environments, not the impairments themselves per se, that create conditions where disability becomes realized. Disabilities become visible and perhaps more limiting within certain environmental contexts and pedagogical practices. So at the beginning of this course, I encouraged you to consider where the in is within inclusion. If inclusion means that children are required to meet the status quo, then that means entering into normativity and normative discourses. If we tease apart, rethink, and reconfigure where in is, I wonder what kinds of spaces might emerge in early childhood education that might thrive in multiplicity. Something I also invite you to consider this week is as we critique notions of disability within a social constructionist lens, is that we cannot forget the reality that living with impairments has real challenges and often pain that shouldn't be overlooked. As we challenge damage-centered narratives, I'm not suggesting in the same breath that we abandon all diagnoses. Within our current system, diagnoses often allows for further support and resources. However, as early childhood educators, being cognizant of the language we use, when we use it, and why, the audience, why, is crucial. So for example, the language I use when I'm advocating for funds for a child's support in the classroom might be very different than the language that I use when I'm conversing with children, families, and other educators in my pedagogical work. In that thought, it's no surprise that damage-centered narratives often permeate education. And in my experience, they're very alive in schools. So thinking with Tuck's argument this week, we can see how deficit-centered stories create pathologizing narratives of damage to explain what are actually ongoing structural inequalities and environmental inequalities. And these narratives solidify people's identities into fixed terms. So I think it's worth unpacking why these damage-centered stories are so well told within the structures of a school. What conditions allow these stories to thrive and breed in education specifically? Tuck moves toward a desire-centered framework, not as a simple counter story to damage or to tease, or to erase the difficulty of life, but as a framework which better attends to the complexity and contradictions of personhood, the structures which frame positionalities, and the inherent wisdom and self-determination of peoples. So ultimately, I think desired-centered narratives aim to tell multifaceted stories of people which, and I'm borrowing from Tuck here, quote, complicate our understanding of human agency, complicity, and resistance, end quote. So in the provocation this week, we'll spend more time thinking together about the conditions that create spaces for damage-centered stories to thrive and the social values that inform these conditions. So I look forward to seeing where these conversations take us this week. Happy writing, everybody.